Hello, and welcome to our weekly live webcast with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's July 19th, 2023. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I will be your host today. To join in the discussion, if you have some questions or comments, you can send them to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org. Now, Helga, in listening to reports from organizers and supporters of what we're doing, there's a growing recognition of what you've been saying, that the way to defeat the war hawks is with an international peace coalition, building a new strategic and development architecture. As this mobilization is getting momentum, we're seeing still the drive of the war hawks to engage in more dangerous provocations following the Vilnius NATO meeting, the attacks on the Kerch Bridge yesterday, the deployment of naval maneuvers between the United States, Japan, and South Korea in the Pacific region. But we're also seeing growth of the Peace Coalition. So what's your assessment of where things stand right now?
Well, I think the problem is that until we get a break in the present intention by the Western establishment to, basically isolate Russia, to contain China, to curb the rise of China, to stick with the bloc building, the thinking, that the world needs to be separated in a bloc of the so-called free democracies against the so-called authoritarian regimes. And naturally, this is a completely distorted view of reality, because the issue is really that the unipolar world, or those people who started out to be the proponents of an unipolar world after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the 30 plus years since, obviously, rather than reviewing the situation and coming to the conclusion that the whole Fukuyama thesis about the end of history, that the whole world would become Western liberal democracies sticking to the neoliberal economic system, that was the view, that view was wrong. And rather to make a competent reassessment and say, maybe, our analysis, our intention didn't correspond to the world, how it is evolving. They can't do this. They seem to be incapable of reflecting on the axiomatic failure of their intention. So what has happened in the meantime, naturally, is that rather than China, after the admission to the WTO, became a Western liberal democracy, China did something completely different. They went to their 5,000-year-old tradition and history and incorporated some of the advantages of the global, or access to the global markets, but they became more Chinese than ever before, more, stuck to the Confucian tradition of 2,500 years, more stuck to the traditional Chinese cultural values. And who wants to blame them? They have a right to be a culture. They are the largest, or by now the second largest nation in terms of population. They have one of the most ancient civilizational traditions. So why would somebody who represents 4% of the world population insist that they can make the rules for not only China but also India, Indonesia, Brazil, Africa, that they all should submit to that Western model of how to do things, whereby naturally the rules of this famous rules-based society are never quite defined. And when you ask who made them, there is no place you can look it up. When you try to see how it functions, it's quite flexible. Sometimes these rules have one standard, like in the case of Crimea, but then when you look at Kosovo, the same de facto condition is applied with completely different rules. You could make this list very long. So rather than accepting the fact that, the there is an impulse of the developing countries to really develop. And since China offered the only available system with the Belt and Road Initiative 10 years ago, naturally these countries of the global south all, flock around China, and they're now building a new system. So, as long as that basic conflict is not being resolved, and it can only be resolved by the people in the United States and the people in Western European nations recognize that the demand of these countries of the global south is a completely legitimate one, and that they cooperate and they stop this absolute horrible idea that you have to confront it, that you have to expand NATO into a global NATO, which, by the way, was very strongly rejected by China after the Vilnius summit, calling NATO basically a gang of gangsters or some other basically rather sharp formulation. So I think as long as this conflict is not resolved the way I'm indicating, I think we will go from one crisis to the other, despite the fact that in the meantime, it's admitted even in the Daily Telegraph, and a person called Robert Clark from the Civitas think tank in Great Britain, that, the West has to start to accept that they will have, or Ukraine will have territorial losses, because first of all, the Ukrainian counteroffensive did not go anywhere. Secondly, with Ukraine going in its present, condition into a new winter, it would be hardly survivable. And thirdly comes the US election and other elections, which will basically create a different condition. So better to end the war through negotiation. So that is really what should happen. And, there's no sign from NATO. There was not one mention even that a possibility existed for a peaceful negotiation through diplomacy or dialogue, nothing of this sort. And that has for sure been noticed by the countries of the global south. So when you look at the recent summits, I think the G20 summit of finance ministers in India, or just now in Brussels, the CELAC EU summit, where basically, the Western countries were trying extremely hard to get the countries of the global south to join in declarations condemning, quote, the unprovoked war of aggression of Russia or by Russia. So the countries of the global south did not want to sign that because they don't believe it. So why would they sign something they see different? Because they have their own experience of colonialism. They have seen who gives them some real development in terms of railway, bridges, ports. It's not the West. The West had 500 years to overcome colonialism, but they didn't, or 600 years for that matter. So I think that the ball is in the court of Western Europe and the United States to change their policy. And, I think the more people speak out and say, we demand a peaceful solution to this conflict, the better. And the faster it occurs also, because, it's like before World War I and before World War II, there came a certain point when the window of opportunity closed and the war became inevitable. And I'm just afraid that while nobody totally knows when that window would close, you can have a mistake, you can have something by accident, you can have a miscalculation, but we are very close to that window of opportunity closing. So this is why I think the efforts of the International Peace Coalition and the Humanity for Peace efforts with the upcoming demonstrations are so extremely important.
And we'll have a press release linked to our description of the International Peace Coalition, the growth of it, and how you can get in touch with us and become a part of that. Now, there are a lot of questions that come off what basically you just laid out, but I want to start with one from a contact in Brazil who asked, does the failure thus far of the counteroffensive in Ukraine make it more or less likely that the various peace initiatives will succeed? And he mentions the Lula peace initiative, but also the meeting of the Pope's envoy, Cardinal Zuppi, with President Biden in the last day or so.
Well, I would hope so that, the escalation of all of these peace initiatives which should work together will shift the public opinion. I think this, what President Lula is doing in many places around the world is extremely important because, he is basically more and more emerging as a complete authority in the minds of many people in the world. So I think this is very, very important. Then I would like to have been a little bird in the discussion between President Biden and Cardinal Zuppi, who is, after all, the head of the Italian Bishops' Conference, who met with Biden for 2 hours. And, for such a meeting, 2 hours is quite long. It's unusual and promising. I think it was generally recognized and well received. For example, one of the Putin advisors, Ushakov, praised it and said it was what Zuppi was doing was very balanced and impartial. And Zuppi now will obviously go back to the Pope and brief him, and he indicated that was not the last trip he is undertaking. Given the fact that President Biden is a Catholic, and the word transmitted by Cardinal Zuppi comes from the Pope, I'm really interested, and I would have liked to be a bird listening into the discussion because, if the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope, who after all is in the Catholic religion the representative of God on earth, is talking to the President of the United States in a very clear way, he should listen. So let's see what happens. I think that the initiatives must escalate very quickly. And I know that some people who, I don't want to say yet who they are because it's still being worked out, are writing letters that, the absolute need is for the different branches or different groups of the international peace movement to really put all differences aside and work together and show up in large numbers for the different demonstrations on August 6th, which is the anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing. And I can only appeal to you, our present audience, please do whatever you can to get in contact with us. If you are close to New York, show up in New York at the demonstration in front of the United Nations. And then if you are not in New York, find out where in your country are satellite demonstrations and make them as big as possible by not only showing up there yourself, but organize all your friends and contacts, because this is really important that we have a big showing on August 6th.
You're listening to Helga Zepp-LaRouche of the Schiller Institute. We can still take your questions. You can send them to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org. Now, sticking with the question of Italy, we have a question from an Italian supporter who reported that she was glad to see that Prime Minister Meloni came out against the U.S. deployment of cluster munitions, which, according to news reports, have arrived in Ukraine, and that Biden has continued to stick with his decision to send cluster munitions. So the question is, does it make a difference that Meloni speaks out? Is there not a mechanism of some sort for a veto in NATO against this policy?
Well, with all of these questions, according to international law, all the countries who have signed the convention to ban cluster bombs would be obliged to not only passively accept decisions, but to actually fight for the banning of cluster bombs. That goes, for example, for Steinmeier and Scholz, who made rather absurd statements by saying, commenting on Biden's decision to send these cluster bombs, that I think Steinmeier said something that he can't fall into the arm of Biden. And Scholz said something that this is a sovereign decision by the United States. I mean, these are just completely absurd statements. And they just pertain to the fact that for the time being, unfortunately, Germany has lost all sovereignty, and they have completely capitulated to being a vassal of the United States, which is quite despicable. And one can only hope that many people really get rid of this government as quickly as possible, because they're not representing the interest of the German people. So I think it is very important that Meloni does that, because, given the constellation of powers in the world as it is, the more voices come on the right side, the better. And eventually, that side has to win over, because this cluster bomb question is hideous. It's absolutely hideous. And no person who has any self-respect should support it.
I just got a follow-up question from that person who just asked, why is it that most of the rest of the world, or at least the West, is allowing the United States to continue to talk about the rules-based order and ignoring international law and treaties?
Well, it's essentially because, people are afraid, or they are cowards. I mean, my experience is that, the mainstream media are trying to create the impression as if the opinions of everybody is completely streamlined and they all agree with, the officialdom and their policies. But I think this is absolutely not the case. When you talk to somebody by accident in the street and you scratch a little bit the surface, what comes out is an explosion of rage, of despair, of, basically the opinion is that you can't say things anymore freely because, you're being ostracized immediately. But the rage factor and the disappointment, the discrepancy between the population and what the governments are pretending in the mainstream media could not be bigger. So I think that this is not going to last for very long, because, Germany, for example, is being deindustrialized with a speed. Every day you get new figures. I think 22%, no, actually more, 26% of all middle-sized firms are considering seriously to close down their firm because they can't afford anymore the energy prices, the taxes, the competitive moves from especially the United States, also in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act and similar things. And another more than 20% of the people of the middle-level industries are considering to invest in either United States or China or some other place, but not anymore in Germany. So with that rate of disinvestment, the German economy is about to be halved. Do you know what that means for the health system, for the school system, for infrastructure, which is falling apart already as it is? So I think that the seeming calm, now people go to holiday and they somehow are distracted, but I cannot see how this goes much longer without an eruption of tremendous proportions.
Now, speaking of eruptions, there's an election campaign, as you noted, coming up in the United States. And I have a question from someone who signed in as a political junkie. And he writes, LaRouche ran as a Democrat and as an independent. Diane Serre, your colleague, is running as an independent. Is it possible that 2024 might be the year to challenge the phony two-party system in the United States?
Well, looking at it from a distance, I would say yes. What seemed to be completely impossible in the United States, that an independent candidacy would have any chance, I think this is now changing because it's recognized by so many more people that it really doesn't matter, which party you vote for. Naturally, you have now candidates on both sides. Trump, who is being gone after, he claimed that tomorrow he will be indicted. So let's see if that happens. There is a tremendous fear by the establishment on both sides of the Atlantic that Trump somehow may get back to power, even if I must say, he still has things in his program, as far as it is known, which are highly problematic, like America First. We are trying to build a new paradigm in which humanity is first, and that all national interests have to be in coherence with that interest of humanity as a whole, which is the only way how you can overcome geopolitics and the danger of war. Now, Trump says he can end the Ukraine war in 24 hours. That may be or not be, but I think we have to move to a new paradigm. We have to think about humanity completely different, not in terms of a competing bunch of nations who all have elbows out and persist on their interest, but that we really start to think about the future of humanity as a whole, and think about the harmony of interest of Carey, or think about the pre-established harmony of Leibniz. There's so many philosophies and theories which give you an idea that a harmonious world is absolutely possible and in interest of everybody. And that's what the new BRICS nations are trying to realize. So I think that then you have on the Democratic side, you have Robert Kennedy Jr. Now that is obviously very interesting because he has a lot of respect from all kinds of quarters inside the United States and also internationally. If he would win the primary, would the Democratic Party support him? If he does not win the primary, would he submit to the candidate, whoever that may be, probably Biden? Then you would have another Bernie Sanders phenomena, and all the followers of Bernie Sanders are completely disappointed, and they have created new parties and so forth. So this is very much in flux. But given, what the present incredible strategic situation is, the short answer, which now was not so short, is yes, I think potentially an independent party would have the possibility to challenge the Wall Street military-industrial complex crowd.
Now, here's a question, which actually two questions combined. On the immigration issue or the migration issue in Europe, there's a lot of disputes over the EU policy. It's obviously a mess. Viktor Orban of Hungary has been speaking out against it. There are problems of child trafficking, which are being alleged, cheap labor. Polarization is resulting because of the lack of funds to take care of immigrants. This is another one of these messes of the European Union. Is there anything they're doing that can address this, or how would you address this so-called migration crisis?
Well, I think there is a very easy way to address it, and that will be the test for all of these people. It was raised at the recent International Finance Summit in Paris by Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa. He said that, if the international community wanted to do anything in terms of migration and the problems involved with it, they would finance immediately the Inga Dam in Congo, which would provide electricity for about 6 African countries, given the fact that 600 million Africans do not have access to electricity, this is a life and death question. So since the building of that dam would only cost $80 billion, which is really not that much if you think how much money is being thrown around to save bankrupt banks, that will be the test. So if you want to stop the migration problem, build the Inga Dam, build the Transaqua project to refill Lake Chad and transport a tiny amount of water from the Congo River into Lake Chad, which would be the basis for the industrialization of 12 African countries in the heart of Africa. And there are a couple of other such projects. I mean, what is happening right now is disgusting. You know, the EU is trying to run around from Tunisia, and they will go to other North African countries and try to get agreements with them whereby, you know, camps are being built, which Pope Francis correctly has called concentration camps, in which entire families with children, with babies, are put behind barbed wire. They can't get out, nobody can get in. And so hopefully the architects of this policy think that this is a horrifying enough example so that other refugees don't even come to the possibility of entering boats to cross the Mediterranean, where many of them are drowning. But they take the risk because what they're running away from is in their view, worse the risk. So this has to stop, and the only way to stop it is if the Europeans want to do something about migration, they should cooperate with China. And, you know, that is what Macron discussed when he was in Xi'an 2 years ago. He said China and France should develop together the African continent. China should help us that we learn our lesson from colonialism. Macron is very good in making beautiful speeches, but if you then look what happens, in any case, it's still the right policy. The Europeans should join with China in the development of Africa. And what they're doing right now is the exact opposite. You just had the CELAC EU summit in Brussels Monday and Tuesday. And all that was a tremendous effort to convince the heads of state of the Latin American continent to basically, go with the global gateway as, in contrast to the Belt and Road Initiative of China, and get all of these countries to condemn Russia. Now they refused it, so they did not end up with a declaration. And, it's this futile idea to continue to play the game of geopolitics against Russia, against China. But what is needed is, if you want to stop the migration disaster, which, puts a stain on any moral pretension by the Europeans, they should really build the Inga Dam, build Transaqua, build ports, infrastructure, railway, mechanization, processing of food, transport. All of these things are easy, and we have all written them out since a long time. And that way people would love to stay in their home country and build it up. This is what several presidents of Africa have said. Why should the young people in Africa leave? Because they are the labor power which is needed to build up their own countries. But they need conditions to do it. So that's the moral test for the Europeans.
Now, you're listening to Helga Zepp-LaRouche of the Schiller Institute. And Helga, I think we have one more multiple-part question. Actually, it's several people wrote in to say congratulations for the work you're doing. One, Rufin Mastaki from Congo, thanks the Schiller Institute for its work, and he says that unity and cooperation is the only way to succeed. We need the new paradigm of peace through mutual development. That's what we must work for. Now, in that context, there's a question. Why have we become so polarized instead of united to defeat this push for global fascism?
Well, it's the oldest trick of empires, and not starting with the British Empire, but going back all the way to the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Venetian Empire, the Dutch, Holland, the British Empire, their method always has been divide and conquer. Because if you can, play the different groupings, ethnic groupings, cultural groupings, national groupings against each other, then you can control them. So it's very simple. And I think people have to really recognize that, this whole idea that you have to represent my little interest against your little interest, that's just helping the empire. And we have to really go to a different method in thinking. And I have proposed since quite a while that the thinking of the Platonic humanist tradition of Europe, let it be Plato, who had the idea that the idea is what always supersedes a previous conflict, and you arrive at new ideas through the hypothesis of higher hypothesis. Or you have the idea of Nicolaus of Cues with the coincidence of opposites, the idea that the one which can be synthesized in the mind of a person is of a higher order than the many, and that you always can define the interest which encapsulates, I'm sorry about this English, which puts together the interest of all. And I think that is the approach we have. And right now, I think, we have to have peace through development for every nation and every corner of the planet, and then we can find solutions.
Well, and Helga, some people have called this what you're talking about, the higher peace movement. And I'd urge everyone watching this to become a part of that movement. Follow what we're doing on the schillerinstitute.com, become a member, organize with us for events on August 6th. If there's not one in your area, create one. Organize people to show up and put forward this idea of the unity of the human race as a one. So Helga, we've come to the end. Do you have anything you'd like to say in conclusion?
Well, I think, this is a moment in history which, the Chinese would say, they would congratulate us and say, or all of us, that we are living in interesting times. And it's good to live in interesting times because, there are many periods in history where not much happens because things are more or less progressing at a slow pace. You think about the 70s, the 80s, these were periods, except naturally the end of the 80s with the fall of the wall. But these were periods where for a long time not much change was happening. And then come periods like, the fall of the wall in 89, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there you had the chance to make something completely new. You could have erected a peace order, which we were trying to do with proposing the Eurasian land bridge, something which has now grown into the World Land Bridge, the BRI, trying to bring development to all corners of the planet. That chance was missed by the West by insisting on this unipolar world and domination by the West only. So now this policy is basically boomeranging. It's this policy has caused a tremendous blowback. And now we are again at one of these absolute points, where something new is being formed. The old order is clearly disintegrating. What is the shape of the new order is not yet totally clear. And that is the moment when the role of the individual is more important than anything else, because it is the courageous action of moral people, thinking people, creative people, which can make a difference. And right now, I think that is why you, meaning you who are listening and watching this, are really important. Normally people say, oh, I can't do anything. What does it make a difference? Those above, they will always do what they want. No, this is a moment where it does matter what you do and what is, a group of people who work together for a good plan can accomplish. So I can only invite you, join us and join this effort.
Well, thank you for that summary, Helga, and happy to see you today and look forward to seeing you again next week.
Yes, till next week.